I'm delighted to be here, and whenever I was driving up here, it was a beautiful day, and I didn't see anyone out at the golf course, but it always reminds me of the story about the man who told his family and his employer that he was going off to a conference one day, and instead he snuck off on the golf course. So the Lord saw this and summoned St. Peter, said, this man, Mr. Jones, has sinned. He's lied to his family. He's lied to his employer. I want you to devise a suitable punishment. So St. Peter said, don't worry, Lord, I'll take care of it. So tees up on the first hole of par 3, and he hits a beautiful 5-iron and bounces on the green, rolls in the hole for hole in one. The Lord's kind of perplexed, but he has great confidence in St. Peter, so he watches with interest as the man tees up on the second hole, short par 4, dog leg to left. Hits a perfect drive, cuts the corner of the dog leg, bounces in front of the green, rolls up another hole in one. At this point, the Lord can't restrain himself. He summons St. Peter and says, I told you to punish this man. And here he has played 2 holes. He had 2 holes in one. St. Peter smiled and said, you're right, Lord. 2 holes in one. Most exciting thing that's happened to him in his entire life, and who's he going to tell? So, aren't you glad you followed the straight and narrow path and you're here today rather than out there? But it's been obviously a challenging time from an economic development perspective for this country in the last few years. And I don't view this so much as a Democratic challenge or Republican challenge, although it certainly falls on those of us who are in office at the state or federal level. But it's an American challenge. And our ability, our success in understanding the situation we're in relative to job creation here in Minnesota and across this country and others in similar situations elsewhere is going to be absolutely crucial to whether those of you I see who are younger than I am, which is an increasing proportion of you, and also, well, I always know when the microphone ticks it's time to quit. So. But for our children and for our grandchildren, I've been to China 6 times in the last decade, and I've seen some of those 1.3 billion people willing to work and work very hard for 50, 60 cents an hour. It's better than 2 cents an hour in the village at jobs that used to be in this country. I went to a Nike plant about an hour out of Shanghai, small plant, only 5,000 workers. The large ones, I'm told, have 100,000 workers. And they said 250 pairs of hands touches every pair of Nike shoes they produce there. It's not high tech. It's not automation. It's just cheap but very motivated, hard-working people. Young women are sewing the seams. It's August. The young men are standing about 100-degree temperature in front of these industrial waffle irons, and the sole comes in, and they put the iron down, perforates it. Somebody else takes it, puts it in the oven, cooks it. Someone else takes it out. And those jobs aren't coming back. So the challenge for all of us with the 223,000 Minnesotans who are out of work, looking for work, and for the millions of Americans who are in that same situation, about 40% of whom economists say were previously in jobs that are not likely to return to this country, is how do we shape our economic future? Minnesota. And I realize I'm speaking at the city named by Money Magazine as the best place in the country to live last year. So, there are fabulous exceptions that those of you who are responsible for Eden Prairie's government and business development and quality of life should continue to take deserved credit for. But in general, we face this question, this challenge. How do we take what has been Minnesota's remarkable success for the 40 or so years up to about 2001 or 2, where through good and bad economic times, we typically were in the very top 10, at least the top third among the states in the nation in employment growth and per capita income growth. We were in both relative and real terms successful overall. In 2002, we ranked 7th among the states in the nation in per capita income. The last most recent statistic, which is 2010, we were at 13th. So we went from 7th to 13th in per capita income compared to other states. So something's missing. And again, this is not partisan. This is just Minnesotan. There's something that's shifted, and it's probably a combination of factors. And so it really is incumbent on all of us to be pulling our best effort together to figure out how do we get Minnesota back on that track to the kind of continued economic growth and success that is going to be so crucial to everything we value about the state. I've had 4 regional economic development summit meetings so far. The last one yesterday up in Virginia, one in Winona, one in Fergus Falls, one in Brainerd, and have 7 more of them leading up to a state conference at the end of October, which I stress is the starting point, not the end point, for the action plan that we want to develop to move our economy forward. I give credit for this concept to former Governor Arnie Carlson, who said the state needs a business plan. Business plan, economic development plan. We need a strategy that we can largely agree on and that's going to give us a sense of focus and priorities. Arnie's the one who said once, if you don't know where you're going, any path will take you there. Well, we need to know where we're going. We need to know how we're expending public funds and private funds in the way that's most conducive to our successful future. And so in these meetings so far, there have been some common themes I've heard from businesses around the state, and it's instructive because, you know, it's been the last couple of months the Capitol in this echo chamber, and you think that, at least in a lot of views, the solution is just eliminate government at all levels and everything else will work out. But I find in the real world, particularly at least in greater Minnesota, there's a much greater recognition on the part of businessmen and women of the importance of government and the partnership that needs to exist between good government, effective, cost-effective government, and success in the private sector. For example, in Fergus Falls, the 2 largest employers there are private employers, or the hospital, and the another health-related facility consortium of nursing homes, hospice care, home health services, and the chief executive of the hospital operation there said that for every, this is his number, I haven't corroborated this, for every 10 jobs created in the healthcare industry, there are 6 jobs in the private sector, services and other supports that are generated by that. Seem to be confirmed anecdotally in Fergus Falls by the fact that there's a Walmart store being built there. That'll be 150 jobs. Walmart presumably has made its own determination that, you know, there's a future there in terms of people with enough income to have enough customers to be successful. So, and they stressed, as did hospital chief executives in virtually every other area in greater Minnesota, the importance of the early opt-in for Medicaid, which I supported, which is not only about providing better health care to 100,000 Minnesotans, which is important, but also about, as many of them said, the difference between solvency and bankruptcy for especially the smaller hospitals and those of greater Minnesota with a higher proportion of Medicaid patients whose economics depend upon a better reimbursement. We talked about infrastructure, the need, especially smaller communities without the pockets that some of the metropolitan local governments possess, to make the sewer and water and other infrastructure improvements that are essential to attracting new business and industry and the expansion of existing. In Chisholm, Minnesota, for example, because of the antiquated wastewater treatment center there, they're not able at this point by PCA and EPA's regulations to accept any additional business or manufacturing employers. So, you know, once again, they're constrained by that. Similarly, smaller communities north of Fergus Falls. And one that occurs over and over again is the need for a better linkage between our higher education institutions, and particularly the vocational colleges as we get in more in the manufacturing sector, and businesses that are looking for employees even now and don't see the people looking for work with the necessary skills to be employed. Even the area like Brainerd, which has the highest unemployment right now, about 14% of any growing county, of any county in the state. There are employers that are looking for workers, but there's not the linkage. And as one manufacturing company CEO down in Winona said a couple weeks ago, when you are teaching in a vocational college the skills necessary and with the technology necessary to prepare people for the work that's going to be out there, you can't be teaching history. You got to be teaching current events, or even better, the future, the kind of technology and the kind of training that's going to be applicable to the jobs now and in the coming years. So you look, for example, in Staples Vocational College, where I was told by the business agent that 20 years ago they had a budget of $1 million a year for making the capital, the technological improvements, so they were up to date with what they were teaching their students. Last year was $10,000. So these investments that we make, and I stress again the need for a balance between expenditures, government expenditures, and keeping everything within proper limits and being tax sensitive and guaranteed to make sure that government is as cost effective and efficient as possible. But at the same time, recognizing that there are these investments we've made, that our future is not to try to compete with China for jobs at 50, 60 cents an hour working in a 100-degree factory sewing seams. Our future is about the brain power and then the focus of the education of our young people so that they are going to be the entrepreneurs of the future, so they are going to be the employers of the future, so they're going to be the productive employees of the future in the areas, the industries, the sectors that we provide in Minnesota, the kind of value added that's so important. I'll just close on one note. I was asked to keep my comments brief. By U.S. Senate standards, this is like an introduction. And to a lot of time for questions, which I welcome. But, in China they have a company called M3, and it takes 3M products like Stickum pads and Scotch tape, and they imitate them. And they do that very effectively. But what they don't have in China as yet, and the key to our continued economic competitive advantage around the world, is because they don't grow up in a capitalist economy, because they don't grow up in a democratic society, they don't have the sense of the ability and the tools intellectually to take an idea, start a company, succeed in that economic environment, attract well-educated workers who can then help grow the company through the brain power and the application of that to the commercial opportunities. As yet, they don't have that, not nearly at least to the extent we have it here. And that, if you ask me, is what is our future? It's going to be both better quality education and linking that education to the jobs and the economic growth that we need in the future. So that's what we're going to focus on. As I say, welcome everyone's ideas, and we welcome your participation in this economic growth endeavor, because once again, the future of Minnesota so clearly depends upon it. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to respond to questions. Yeah.
Do you have anything you can share with us in terms of programs or ideas that are emerging from the summits that you're having? I mean, any new initiatives, economic development initiatives or tools perhaps the state might think about adopting?
Well, I mean, the one that's come clearly to mind, and I met with the new chancellor of the MNSCU system and the new president of the University of Minnesota is, and this does not involve necessarily more money, more expenditures, except I think in taking the technology in the vocational colleges and the equipment and the like, and improving that. But it's just, again, focusing our education on the training, STEM education, and the kind of vocational training that's going to lead young people, have them prepared for the jobs of the future. I mean, it's really the service to people who are, a number of these community colleges and vocational colleges, people are coming back to work mid-life, and I'm coming back to college mid-life to get trained or retrained for a job in the future. And if they don't, we're not training them in that 1 or 2 years with the set of skills and that are going to enable them to get a job when they walk out the door. I mean, it's a great disservice to them, as well as it doesn't produce what we want, which is another trained employee who can go into one of these companies all over the state. We're looking for employees to expand and grow. So I'd say that's number one. The infrastructure, is a Minnesota challenge that's a national challenge. I mean, you go to China and you see these high-speed rail trains go from downtown Shanghai to the airport at 240 miles an hour, take the European equivalent of their high-speed bullet trains, 180 miles an hour across the, and at the same time, we take one of those, say from Beijing to Tianjin, which is about an hour and well, it's 27 minutes by the high-speed rail. You can get on an interstate highway that's better quality and less congested than anything we have here in Minnesota right now, and you can drive there in about an hour and a half. So it's not just the high-speed rail and whether that's cost-benefit analysis you can get into later, but it's just the investment in our infrastructure. And you think that back in the 1950s and early 60s, I mean, the generation that came out of World War II, essentially, and President Eisenhower deserves great credit for the interstate highway system. I mean, they built the infrastructure, the highways and the sewer water, the airports, the runways, largely with federal money that we've used and for the last half century, and they did so, and the federal deficit never exceeded 3% of revenues. So they found a way back then, a responsible way for not only investing in ways that benefited them in the next few generations, but they also did it in a fiscally responsible way. So we have in the transportation department, at my request, Commissioner Sorrell has convened a group to look at what are the financing options for our highway system. If you, as I have, been driving around the state of Minnesota for the last 49 years. I'm 64, so 15, I see. And especially the last 20 years, the congestion here in the metropolitan area has gotten worse. The deterioration of our highways throughout the state are worse. There are places that have used a combination of federal bonds with a federal revenue stream called Garvey bonds and state bonds. And Georgia, for example, has a program called 27 and 7, where they're completing in 7 years highway projects that would have taken 27 years if they hadn't used this approach. We've got antiquated approach of pay a dollar for a dollar work. Well, that's fine if you have the money, but the cost of these projects are increasingly prohibitive, that approach. And again, if we're delaying those kind of necessary investments in these improvements, we're gonna really hamstring our future economic growth, because of business people and talented employees who have options where they live are going to take a place where they can get to and from work, where they can get their kids to and from school and the ball games and the like. So our failure to make the necessary investments in improving our infrastructure, particularly our highways and public transit too, but the reality is most people are going to use automobiles. So our failure to keep pace in that is going to be catastrophic in my view. So my approach is we need to level with everybody in Minnesota and say, this level of expenditure, what are our options? If we continue to spend the same amount, what are the conditions going to be like 10 and 20 years from now? If conversely we want to sort of break, and it's probably going to deteriorate, if we want to break even, kind of keep things where they are now in terms of quality, in terms of congestion, commute times, this is what we would need to spend, and this is how we could choose to finance it. If we want to improve matters, and say your commute is 40 minutes, and we want to aim to reduce it to 30 minutes or 20 minutes, what would that cost? And what are our options for financing that? And then, people can make a real world decision. What am I willing to pay for, and what do I have a right then to expect in return? So I think that's going to be also crucial. And then, the number one tax problem I've heard from businesses around the state is property taxes. And the state of the last decade has shifted the tax burden increasingly on the property tax, individual and commercial, and that's meant that property taxes went up by 75% over the last 8 years. And you read in the paper what the effect is of the last legislative session. It's likely to drive property taxes higher. Now, some people are in denial and say, well, that's a local government decision. Well, most local governments have two sources of income: property tax revenue, and then doesn't affect Eden Prairie, but for a lot of the communities in Minnesota, it's local government aids. And some have a local sales tax option or other revenues, but for most of them, that's basically it. Well, if you cut one of those, and there are only two of them. You can cut expenditures, and almost all local governments have, but at a certain point, you get into police and fire and the other essential protections, and the reality is that if you cut local government aids, property taxes are going to be forced up. So that's, I'd say, another area where, from a policy standpoint, we really need to look at the whole balance of taxes in Minnesota, the configuration of them, and again, what's most conducive to supporting future growth. Yeah.
Governor, Cecilia Cervantes, head of the Technical College, and thank you for supporting education, particularly the bonding bill that you signed and worked with the legislature on that provides almost $10.6 million to Hennepin Technical College in order for us to improve our educational programs and services in order to serve almost 23,000 credit and non-credit students in Eden Prairie, in Brooklyn Park, and in all the communities in between.
Well, good. And when I met with Chancellor Rosenstone, I said, let's ask him to look at, based on what I'm hearing, and maybe in some places it's better than others. I hope it's better here. But let's determine the needs, especially in the vocational technical colleges, and see, what kind of investments in, again, technology and machinery equipment are necessary so that the businesses in those areas are going to get the trained employees they need to expand. So that'll be a priority if we have a bonding bill next year and thereafter, and it's going to have to be a continuous effort. But thank you.
Come anytime.
Good. Thank you. Yes.
Governor, Chuck Mueller, School Board here in Eden Prairie. Thank you for your service. I love your dogs. Do you envision a time when the state will get current with its obligations to schools in Minnesota under the Constitution?
Yeah. Well, the school board member's asking when will the state, get its financial house in order so that we can meet our obligations to schools. And, I had a solution last session, and it wasn't agreeable to the legislature, but it was an honest, ongoing solution in that it raised revenue not on a one-time basis as the tobacco bonds or the school shift does. It raised revenues by raising income taxes on the wealthiest 2% of people who the Department of Revenue's analysis says are paying a smaller percentage of their income in state and local taxes than most of the rest of Minnesotans. And that's, as I say, sustained, reliable, and ongoing. And we wouldn't have had to do the shift. We wouldn't have had to issue $750 million in state increased indebtedness backed by future revenues, the tobacco revenues. And the combination of those two unquestionably was a big reason that our credit rating has been dropped. And that means higher cost of borrowing, and it's just it's a stigma on our overall reputation for sound financial management. We could, again, address that by my approach of raising income tax revenues. Some have proposed now at the very end of the session the racinos, or the Block E casino project in downtown Minneapolis, to have some or most or all those proceeds going to pay off the school shift. The one thing I'll say in behalf of the legislature, and it was bipartisan, and myself, is recognizing the effect of the additional 10% of the shift on our schools. We increased, I'm told, for the first time in over a decade, the per pupil aid formula by $50 per student in this year of the biennium, and another $50 the next year. And if you do the math, that for most districts, well, almost every district would offset any additional cost of borrowing. But it's not desirable, it's not responsible, and again, it's not sustainable. So, again, in fairness to ourselves, on the one hand, we had a $5 billion deficit to correct all at once, but I'm not going to in any way defend what the final outcome was, because I said I wouldn't have supported it if I didn't have to end the shutdown.
Yes.
Hi, Nancy Terry-Lucas, Mayor of Eden Prairie. First of all, thank you for your willingness to serve as our governor at one of the most challenging times, I think, in our lifetime. As you know, Southwest Light Rail has gotten permission to go into preliminary engineering. I just wondered a little bit about your thoughts about your commitment to regional light rail system and what you foresee as the likelihood of state funding for the state match.
Question about light rail, the Southwest Corridor project funding. Well, in concept, I support it, and water over the dam. But would that when one of the early metropolitan councils back in the early 1970s recommended this for the metropolitan area, that we had done so back in the days when there was 90% or so federal funding for these projects. So it's certainly not by any means, unanimously or even unanimous or even a consensus in this region, from what I understand, in support of it or in opposition. Representative Holberg, who represents this area, the chairman of Transportation Committee Beard, who has great influence in this, are both on record as opposing it. And I assume they're reflecting the views of at least some of their constituents. So that part has to be resolved. But then, then if you decide you want to do it, who's going to pay for it? And these projects are enormously expensive, and but you do them one at a time. They're doing the Central Corridor now, and they put together before I arrived, but they put together the financing, the federal government, state and local shares. So the same thing would have to be done for this one. But it's I still think the highways are going to be where most people are going to choose to travel, how they choose to travel. But if the more options we give people, and I would say to those people who are commuters or like myself have to depend on an automobile to get around, again, are you willing to make an investment if we could take 1/4 or 1/3 of the current traffic jam during rush hour onto the buses or onto some other alternative mode of transportation? So you got to show that there's a benefit for the people who are going to be paying for it or aren't going to be using those services. And again, hopefully we can over time.
Yes. Mr. Governor, Frank Nolan from the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, and if you or your handlers ever decide you need a little quiet respite when the walls come closing in on you, particularly a tour of an insider's garden named after a prominent Minnesota family with which you are familiar, we're here to serve.
I'm sort of part of the ne'er-do-well branch of the family, but some of them have made important contributions to our community, yes.
Unlike, yes. There is a question I have, and that has to do with the Viking Stadium. And for those of us who are commenters, our source of information is primarily print media. So my question for you is this. Our information of late is not, my question is not focused on why or whether, but when. And it's not really when, but in your mind, is there only a single alternative? I've heard a lot about the one alternative up north, but in your mind, as you get behind this, or have gotten behind this effort, is there a second or a third alternative site in your mind, or is the energy focused on one?
Well, Lester Bagley's here. He could probably answer that more definitively than I. Well, I want to keep the Vikings in Minnesota, and I say I'm site neutral. I only care that it's in Minnesota. The reality is that the ownership of the Vikings, who are committed, for what's again in broad brush still, a $1.1 billion project, and Arden Hills are already committed to $420 million, and I will speculate, unconfirmed, that that's likely to approach anywhere to $500 million by the time the project's said and done. And so, they are, local government, Ramsey County at this point, and the state are also major financial participants, but, they own the team, they're putting a huge amount of money behind the project, and they're saying now that's plan A and there's no plan B. And there's no realistic way we can or should try to force them to go somewhere they don't want to go. The Met Council and the Sports Facilities Commission are doing an analysis of some of the timeline and the cost of the environmental improvements there. You've got some amount of contamination from the federal dump there for cartridge manufacturing years ago. The timeline and the cost of the highway projects, both access in and out of the stadium and also on the freeways, so that when the games are in conjunction with rush hour, everybody will be moving. And then thirdly, taking a look at the expected costs of the overall project. So I think we'll know they tell me it's on schedule for October 15th. I've insisted that it be on schedule, and I think we'll all know a lot more facts and be able to assess at that point, is this project within the scope of time and the cost that is acceptable to the Vikings, acceptable to the public. I've stressed that there cannot and will not be any general fund dollars going into the state's part, $300 million. Needs to be paid for by revenues from the proceeds from the operations of the stadium or some other non-tax or non-public tax source. Ramsey County's got its own separate consideration. There are people who say we ought to have the Racino or the downtown Block E, bypass any kind of tax increase at the local or state level. So, I mean, I think once we know the financial parameters and the real world cost and time parameters of what needs to be done there, then Vikings and the public can make an assessment, is that within acceptable parameters, and if not, then what is Plan B? But at this point, again, it seems to me that's the only option right now that's in the real world available. Not available, but in the real, well, the only one that at this point is under active consideration by the team. Mr. Bagley, here, would you come on up here?
No. I was actually going to ask you another question, and I noticed Tim Pugmire grabbed his headset when he asked the vice question, so you're used to that. But just on the issue, yeah, we hope that there's a package for you and the legislature and the public to consider in the next 30 days or so, and then have a fair assessment of is it the right package, does it fit, does it make sense? So I think we're hopefully on track for that. But and also, I just wanted to take a second to thank you for your leadership on the issue, because it won't get done without leadership, and you've truly stepped up and tried to get the focus on the issue, and we're very appreciative of that. But I was going to ask you a question. I have to go backward into the special session, state shutdown, but it just seemed like not how it was resolved, but there seemed to be a point where you kind of reached, this is ridiculous. We got to get this done. And I just, not to go backward, it was a difficult time for everyone, but what triggered, what came out of that? What triggered that with you? What was the moment that you decided that we got to get we got to get this done, and we stepped up and said, let's bring back the other proposal and let's work this out? Was there a moment there, or a decision?
Well, it's an excellent question. I mean, I said at my State of the State speech early February that I thought it was unthinkable that there could be a shutdown, and I really did. And I think the consequences of it proved that was prescient at the time. I didn't believe we would have one. I didn't expect that we would be forced into one. I thought, because I've been doing this line of work for 36 years now, that at the end, even people with strongly different views would recognize the need to come together to avoid those serious consequences, as they did in Washington, to avoid something that would have been even far more catastrophic, bad as it was here. And I mean, you look back to going back to the founding of this country. I mean, the Declaration of Independence wasn't written with unanimous agreement, and the Constitution. I mean, there's always been these broad differences of views. That's the strength of democracy. But the functionality of democracy requires then people with strongly different views to come to some common agreement when absolutely necessary in order to move ahead. And never in my 36 years have I encountered a group of people for whom compromise was considered a weakness and intransigence was considered a virtue. So we fell over that cliff and got into the shutdown, and I mean, the consequences were mounting, the delays in the highway construction projects. I think with possibly one exception, fortunately, they were able to get back on track, so the ones scheduled for completion this year will be done. Otherwise, we'd have orange cones and lane restrictions through the wintertime. It would be absolutely disastrous. The number of people who then in the private sector as well as the public sector were out of work, who's, in the case of the public sector employees, the private have their own different arrangements. So we're getting some unemployment, some of them, but their one paycheck that they had for the previous 2 weeks is all they were going to get from the state, and so those financial addresses were mounting. So, I'd say the last week, after 1 week to 10 days, it just became clear to me there was not going to be a further offer of willingness. I'd offered 2 of them, further compromises to legislative leadership, and there was literally no response except immediate rejection, but there was no alternative being proposed, and so it was either end the shutdown or not. I'm not happy with the result. Parts of it I agree with, but as I keep stressing in the realm in which I operate, it's probably true in business too. A compromise means you agree to things you don't agree with. I mean, the parts of the package that I still strongly disagree with, and that I agreed to end it. And now some on this homestead credit elimination are trying to say, well, because I signed it, I agreed to it. No, I agreed to it. I vetoed it once. I vetoed it a second time. I finally signed it, after it was insisted upon by the Republican tax leadership, starting with the Senate and then the overall leadership. And so in my world, you know, you take responsibility. You know, if you're grown up and you're responsible, you make decisions and you take the responsibility for the consequences of them, good or bad. And I can disagree with people and I can respect them, and again, that's democracy. But I don't have no respect for somebody who insists on having it their way, and then when it goes awry, tries to blame me or anybody else. That's unacceptable. And so, you know, we'll go back and have a chance in the next session and hopefully do it better. And I hope we've all learned, myself included, that we have an even greater responsibility to get this done on a timely basis and make the concessions necessary to the other side and the collective wisdom of the people of Minnesota who put us all together to do so. On that cheerful note. If I don't get invited back next year, I'm going to play the transcript here to find out. Make sure we invite you back. But you know, if you really want to, you know, catch up, you know, get people back on track, I think the question that you posed to me on the Viking Stadium should be something that Mr. Bagley addresses every other day for the sake of the press who are here. And anyway, we're going to work on that, and it's been good to work with you, Lester, and we'll keep it done for the people of Minnesota. You know. If you look at the Metrodome, that was built with a lot of controversy. I think it passed by one vote. The siting passed by one vote. And for $55 million in bonds that were paid off entirely by the proceeds of the stadium, 30 years ago, we've had one Super Bowl, 2 World Series, near and dear to my heart, a couple Rolling Stone concerts, monster truck mashes, rollerblading, you know, weeknights, chance for, and I've done this with my kids, rent it for, I think, $75 for 2 hours so you can have a birthday party, and kids and parents, you know, more parents showed up than my kids' parties than kids because they wanted to, you know, set foot out on that site. Final Four. I mean, we got, and all the economic ancillary benefits of that, not to mention the construction of building it during what was then a recession. We got our money's worth and more. And this will be a people of Minnesota's stadium. For me to support it, it's got to provide, again, those kind of jobs to build it, to operate it, and all those benefits that, as well as the intangibles that make this a place where people want to live. Thank you very much.